This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development.
I'm Jamie Beckett, and I'm Director of Communications and Alumni Relations here at the School of Engineering. And I'm happy to welcome you tonight to the latest in our career lecture series, when we help you advance your career and offer networking opportunities with fellow engineering alumni. Next up in this series is the Engineering Job Fair that's coming up this fall. But much sooner than that, there's a very special and very different kind of event. We'll be honoring Professor Emeritus Donald Knuth. That's on May 12th. As you probably know, he's author of the seminal work, The Art of Computer Programming. Professor Knuth will be inducted as one of our Stanford Engineering Heroes. It's a brand new program, and that's May 12th. We hope you'll be able to join us then. Tonight, however, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Robert Sutton. As you know, he's a professor of management science and engineering. He's much published, and he studies innovation, leaders, and civilized workplaces, something I think we all probably are interested in. Bob's written 5 books, including the New York Times bestseller, The No Asshole Rule, Building a Civilized Workplace and Surviving One That Isn't. Tonight, however, he'll be sharing his insights from his latest book, Good Boss, Bad Boss, How to Be the Best and Learn from the Worst. We'll be hearing from Bob in just a minute. And after tonight, if you want to follow him, you can follow his blog at bobsutton.net or follow him on Twitter at @work_matters. We'll have time for questions at the end, and I hope you'll be able to stay afterward for networking and refreshments. Thanks, and now Professor Sutton.
Right. Thank you. Better wait till after the speech. So thank you for all coming out tonight. I suspect many of you have been to the building. Well, how many of you, is this the first time you've been to this building? Oh, it's a lot of you. Isn't it a lovely building? Especially compared to the Terman building, the improvement is unbelievable. So I thought I was going to have a life sentence in the Terman building, and it's like being young again. This building is just fabulous. So what I'm going to do tonight is take maybe about 50 minutes or so and talk about some of the main ideas in my latest book, Good Boss, Bad Boss. And at the end, we'll have a little twist, sort of some stuff from the No Asshole Rule on how to deal with a lousy boss at the request of the Alumni Association, which I don't think is a reflection on anybody, but especially Dean Plummer, who's a wonderful guy. So that's what I'm going to do. And let me sort of start out and describe how I ended up writing this book, because I didn't exactly mean to start out writing a book on bosses. Although I've studied management in various forms for quite a few years, as was mentioned, the book I wrote before this was The No Asshole Rule. And one of the good and bad things about writing a bestseller is it's sort of like Hollywood. They always want the sequel. So I was actually under all this pressure to write a sequel to that book. And at one point, I said, well, maybe I really should do it. So I started working on it, and I just kind of didn't have it in me. And I think maybe the sort of final blow was I got a postcard. You know, nobody sends postcard anymore. It was like a handwritten postcard from my publisher in France. And she asked the question, she said, "Dear Bob, when do we see the asshole shits again?" was what the... It actually may have said strikes, but I should probably put it on my blog. It sure looked like the SH word to me. So at that point, I realized that although I may be condemned to being the asshole guy the rest of my life, I did not have another book on the topic in me. So I started thinking about it and looking at sort of like the deluge of emails, the stories that I got that people told me, and I realized something which I knew before, but it really became more vivid, that the central characters in most of the stories people told me, about 80% of the stories they told me, were the boss. So in most cases, frankly, they worked for a boss who was a jerk, because that's what the kind of stories people tell me. In some cases, people told me how great their boss was. And then in a lot of other cases, people would describe to me how they wanted to be, in general, better bosses. And so I started digging into research on management and leadership. And the reason that I picked the word boss in a focus on boss rather than management in general is that if you look at what it takes to have an effective organization overall, there's actually a lot of evidence that it isn't just the boss at the top, it's the overall quality of the bosses in the organization. There's also evidence, even if you look at the way that CEOs have impact on their organizations, it's not like they just magically have an effect. It comes through the quality of the team that they build around them. So even when it comes to the CEO, it's their immediate team that really seems to matter. So that, and then one other point which turns out to be true, the notion that people leave bosses, not organizations, which is a truism, actually turns out to be true. So I was off, and since I have the privilege of working at this university, I had time to work on the book, and I spent several years working on the book. And so what I'm going to do is describe some of the main ideas tonight, but before I do, I want to sort of give us a little bit sort of a background or perspective of how I wrote this book and how I actually write most of my books. But first of all, I want to ask a question. How many of you have heard of Jimmy Buffett? Okay, you're laughing, but not all the hands went up. So just as a Generation Y test, so I gave a version of this talk at Facebook, which is sort of like the Children's Crusade. Anybody who's, especially in engineering, well, and there's some pretty damn smart children there, by the way. Maybe 15% of them had heard of Jimmy Buffett. So if you want to feel old, that's how I felt. Anyways, so in one of his songs, he's got this line that some things are still a mystery to me, and other things are much too clear. And sort of following this philosophy, the way that I wrote this book, and I wrote my other books as well, often with co-authors, with Jeff Pfeffer in particular, is what I would do would be to read the peer-reviewed literature, because I'm still at a research university and I actually believe in evidence-based management. And when I saw sort of a pattern, what I would do is sort of make an assertion, and there's some ideas you hear about tonight. And then since I know research can be pretty boring, I'd usually dig out or find some stories to actually make the evidence come to life. But there were a bunch of cases where I would think that I could find a pattern, but I'd sort of give up. And let me give you one example. So how many of you in organizations where they have performance evaluations? Yeah, I am too. Okay. The literature on performance evaluation is pretty interesting. If performance evaluations were like a drug, they would not get FDA approval. It's sort of like if you look at some reasonable meta-analyses we have lately, about 40% of the time they make things better, 40% worse, and 20% sort of no effect. So I didn't talk very much about performance evaluations, even though it's really interesting. Just about every company I know in the Valley is sort of obsessed with how to do these things right, and there are some organizations that do it better than others. But boy, that's a tough thing to deal with. So most of the stuff in the book are at least things that I believe, based on reading the research, that there's kind of a pattern there. Okay, so now let's move to the main point of the book. There's lots of little points in the book, but if I were to pick sort of a central theme and a thread that runs through much of it, it's this notion that sort of runs contrary in some ways to common wisdom, which is this notion that great bosses are remarkably obsessed, self-obsessed. And there's an expression you've probably heard before, that when you're the boss, it's not about you, which is probably, it's like a useful half-truth, and certainly, and as we'll get into this, I'm not making the case that bosses should be raging narcissists or egomaniacs. That's exactly the opposite of the case I'm going to make. But the fact is, if you look at it from an empirical standpoint, there's an enormously bright light that shines on people when they're in positions of authority, and it actually gets brighter as they get higher. In two ways in which this gets played out. One I talk about a fair amount in the second chapter, and the other one kind of runs through the book. The first one is that when you're in a position of leading other people, your lot in life is that you are going to get more blame and more credit than you deserve for the performance of the people in the organization you lead. And this is just, if you don't want the situation, don't become a boss, or especially a CEO. This is what's going to happen. Academics have looked at all sorts of different conditions under which leadership matters and doesn't. If I was going to give you my rough approximation, and some of my colleagues would probably disagree with me, especially on the first one, on average, bosses are worth maybe 10, maybe 20% of the action and performance. Some of my colleagues would say less, including some Nobel Prize winners. But one thing that academics don't disagree about is basically they get about 50% of the credit and blame for performance. So that's the first way, if you lead others, that you're going to get more credit and more blame than you deserve. And part of your job is to handle some of the symbolic stuff around credit and blame, independently of whether or not stuff is your fault or not. So that's the first point about it, sort of is about you. And the second point is this notion that that when people are in a position of authority, there's this notion of, they call it asymmetrical attention sometime in the social psychology literature, which is the notion that subordinates, people have less power, devote a lot more attention to what their boss does than their boss devotes to them. And so the reason that this creates a challenge is that there's a lot of evidence that the best bosses are in tune with the people they lead. They know what it feels like to work for them. But there's something about being in a position of authority, and maybe we could talk about what it is, that puts you in a position where you pay less attention. And sometimes this creates what I've called the toxic tandem. And what the toxic tandem is a situation where they know a whole bunch about you, and you don't know much about them, and you get in trouble. And let me give you an example. And it's sort of an interesting case. So many of us will remember, and it wasn't much fun, things are much better around here from what I can tell, in most cases, that in early 2009, all around the Valley in particular, and the country, there was layoffs in organizations, and hopefully that's starting to come back a little bit now. So around that time, I was finishing up this book, and I pulled over and wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review called How to Be a Good Boss in a Bad Economy. It was about dealing with downsizing and other sorts of situations, especially how to be compassionate about it. And so I gave a talk. It was one of our executive programs. And afterwards, one of the executives walked up to me and he said, "Let me tell you a story about what happened in our office last week," which was one of the assistants. She walked up to an executive vice president and said to him, "When are the layoffs coming?" And he was like completely shocked because it was one of those sort of well-hidden layoffs nobody knew was coming. And so he admitted, he said, "Yes, in about 2 weeks we're going to have a fairly large-scale layoffs." And then he said to her, "How did you know?" And her answer was, "Well, it was an interesting shoes day for you." So what this guy had was, he had sort of a tell or a leakage thing, if you read some of that thing, where when something bad was going to happen, he would look at his shoes rather than look people in the eye. And the interesting thing about that as being a toxic tandem is, he didn't know that he had an interesting shoes problem, but everybody who worked for him did. And that's sort of the classic sort of indication that they're watching you real closely. So I've already talked about the toxic tandem. Another example, this is Linda Hudson, who's now CEO of BAE Systems. When she became president of another large defense contractor, actually, she tells the story, this was in the New York Times, about how she went to Nordstrom. So she got her new job as president, bought some new clothes, including a new scarf. And so she bought some scarves, and the salesperson at Nordstrom showed her how to tie the scarf in sort of a special, interesting way. And she noticed by the end of the week of her first week, there was about 10 other women in the office tying their scarves the exact same way. But you notice she noticed it, and as the quote says, this is the problem that leaders have, is there's an incredibly bright spotlight on them. This is something that apparently is part of our animal heritage. So the typical member of a baboon troop glances up at the alpha male every 20 or 30 seconds. So it isn't just us, apparently. This is something that's wired in. And it sort of makes sense from the standpoint of, this is the person, or in this case the ape, who can do good or bad things for us because they have more power than we do. So it does have some survival value. But one of the reasons it's so hard for people to be in tune with the people they lead is something that I call power poisoning. There's other names for it in the academic literature. So now we've got at least a good 200 studies that in some ways can be actually kind of discouraging, because they show, independently of personality, when you give people power over others, a whole bunch of things happen which are not particularly good news. Three of the main ones is when you give people power, they tend to focus more on their own needs and concerns. They tend to focus less attention on the needs and actions of others. And they also act like the rules don't apply to them. So this is something that we're all, as human beings, have to fight and happens to us. And just to show you my favorite study that shows how that this can happen, and this isn't the most rigorous study, but it's the cutest. So cute, so of course, very important. So this was done at my alma mater, although they don't like when I say this here, UC Berkeley. And this was done probably about 7 or 8 years ago, and it's reported by Deb Grunfeld, who's at the business school here, and Dr. Keltner at Berkeley. And the basic setup was they had 3 Berkeley students brainstorming about how to solve a social problem. So things like, how do you make the UC Berkeley campus more green? Things like that. But the real manipulation, since they're psychologists, and psychologists just about always lie to their subjects, what was really going on, the real manipulation was about halfway through the little brainstorm, they brought in a plate of 5 cookies. So the question is, and we all know the norm, you don't eat the last cookie, what happens to cookie number 4? And the one thing I didn't add, which is really important, is 2 of them were brainstormers, and one was randomly assigned as the boss to evaluate the quality of the ideas. So you've got this power difference. So what happened was that the people in power tended to take the 4th cookie, and it gets better. There was a 3-item measure of disinhibited eating. They tended to eat with their mouths open. This was independently coded, and leave more crumbs, okay? Also independently assessed, because they were at separate little tables. So if you go back to, this is really cute, but go back to sort of like the 3 findings, more focused on my own needs and concerns, less on the needs of others, and acting like the rules don't apply to me, there really is a risk for anybody who has authority over others that they're going to sort of have this disinhibition problem. One thing I should probably say at this point before we start getting into principles, because I'm talking about all these risks of being an authority, is that yes, just about all people in authority are of risk of having this happen. That's the bad news. The good news is that it turns out, and we've actually got some pretty good national surveys lately, that despite the challenges that bosses face, maybe, it depends on the survey you look at, 75% of Americans will still report that their bosses are competent and caring. So it's not like all the bosses out there are complete losers and are destructive. But the fact is, and I think this is important, that there are certain tendencies that anybody who's in a position of authority has to fight. And I would argue that those of us who are led by others have some responsibility to help them see the light. And we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. Okay, so what I want to do next is to start digging into some hallmarks of in-tune bosses. So these are sort of some of the ideas floating around the book. One of the first one, which I talk about in the first chapter, let me start with this one of assertiveness. So if you read the management literature, like I think the best-selling book in the last 15 or 20 years is Good to Great by a guy named Jim Collins, there'll be a lot of discussion about the importance of charisma. And it turns out, although Jim Collins was very hard on charisma, that people who are charismatic but not selfish or narcissistic probably are more effective leaders. But one of the interesting things that comes from these studies on assertiveness by Frank Flynn and another guy named Daniel Ames is that it turns out, at least in their research, that the level of assertiveness of the bosses was probably more important than charisma. And what they found in a series of surveys, that asked people to rate their bosses and things like, would you want to work for the person again? Would you want to be like that boss? Would you recommend the boss to a friend? How effective do you think the boss was? Things like that. That the main predictor was essentially that the most effective bosses were sort of in the middle in terms of assertiveness. So they were moderately assertive, so some of the measures they used. And the point here is not just that they were medium pushy all the time. That's not what this research shows, especially once they started digging into it. In fact, what the best bosses had was the ability to read the situation they were in and the people they led, and they knew when to push and they knew when to back off. And I think that all of us who've had, well, at least more than one child or have had more than one subordinate, in my case would be largely doctoral students, that there's some of them who you really need to push hard, And some of them, if you push, they just sort of freeze up and you've got to back off. So that notion of being in tune with what it feels like to work for you really does seem to be important, especially when it comes to assertiveness. And as an example, although I'm a San Francisco Giants fan, I think Tommy Lasorda put this quite well the day he took over the LA Dodgers. This is from his autobiography. I believe managing is like holding a dove in your hand. If you hold it too tightly, you kill it. If you hold it too loosely, you lose it. So in general, there's this notion of being in tune. One sort of footnote I would add is that, that on average, the best bosses know when to turn it on and off, but one time when bosses tend to get too pushy in particular is when they're leading innovative or creative work. And overall, just on the sort of pushiness, to go back to the pushiness thing, there's an interesting body of research, some of it reported by done by my colleague Jeff Pfeffer, which shows that, and it's kind of interesting, it shows how bosses become micromanagers and why they believe it works. So what they show is that the more closely a boss watches a subordinate, the more input they give them, the more questions they ask, the more highly they rate the quality of the work done by that person, independently of its objective quality. So what that means is if you watch somebody, coach them, you're going to think, I put all this effort into this, of course they're doing better work, but it's just a cognitive illusion. And in fact, where this gets really bad is when it comes to creative work, where if people start being evaluated and watched closely, they worry about screwing up in front of the boss, so they go back to the tried and true and actually become less creative. So to this point, one of my favorite quotes, this is probably about 8 years ago, I did a panel with this guy, Bill Coyne, who led R&D at 3M for over a decade, and his comment was, after you plant a seed in the ground, you don't dig it up every week to see how it's doing. And with information technology, I think that some bosses can dig it up like every 9 seconds. You know, they can keep sending you an email. They want, and in fact, I gave a talk yesterday where, no, earlier in the week, and I better not say the exact location, but they were doing tweets, and I kept having a guy in the front row tell me how I was doing in mid-talk. It's like, I don't want to know, actually. So I even experienced that this week. One other thing about Bill Coyne that was sort of interesting is he described his role of head of R&D at 3M was largely keeping senior management away from his people, which I thought was actually sort of interesting. Okay, the second thing that's a hallmark of good bosses is wisdom. And this is a topic that my colleague Jeff Pfeffer and I have, well, we've talked about in probably 2 other previous books, and then I talk about it in Good Boss, Bad Boss. The first time I got interested in wisdom as a concept, in fact, was inspired by another Stanford engineering faculty member, David Kelly of IDEO fame. And one of my doctoral students, Andy Hargadon, and I were doing an ethnography at IDEO, and we watched David Kelly in action. And he really is an incredible guy. He's also the founder of the D School, for those of you who don't know. Just an amazing force in the world of innovation. And that's where we first got interested in this notion of wisdom. And to sort of back off on wisdom, it's sort of interesting when you look at somebody like David Kelly in action. They have this ability to be confident enough that they're secure in their ideas, but they somehow or another have enough self-doubt and humility to avoid becoming arrogant jerks. And in the way that this plays out, and we really saw this in action at IDEO, and you can see it in the D School when we're at our best too, which is that people have the attitude of wisdom, have the courage to act on what they know, but they also have enough humility to question their assumptions and actions. It's sort of like this balancing act between, if you will, sort of self-confidence and some humility. And to give you sort of a good definition of this, the famous Andy Grove of Intel fame put this quite well. I think it's very important for you to do 2 things. Act on your temporary conviction as if it's a real conviction, and when you realize you're wrong, correct course very quickly. Sounds really easy. It's incredibly difficult to do. You've got to be very much aware of the impact of what's going on around you. So you've actually got to listen to the people around you. So this is a great quote from John Wooden, the most famous basketball coach probably in history. Don't act as if you're listening and let it go in one ear and out the other. It's even worse to actually fake. Faking it is even worse than not doing it at all. It sounds easy, but very often when executives go to meeting after meeting, they often will get into the mode of pretending to listen but not really listening. There was actually one company, my colleague Huggy Rao and I, Huggy's at the business school, we worked with them about 3 years ago, and there was this one boss, I'll never forget, one of those kind of guys who would just talk and 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 would never actually listen. And we're in a meeting, and there was this moment where he actually shut up and he sat down and appointed somebody else to stand up and do the talking. And he looks at me and he said, it looks like I'm listening, but I'm not really listening. I'm just reloading, thinking about what I'm going to say next. And he was sort of like the classic, like, dysfunctional boss. And one thing I will say, by the way, you think of people like that in large American corporations being able to get away with it. This guy, as we worked with them long enough, he actually got in quite a bit of trouble and got kind of pushed aside. And the main reason was, in their words, is he was all transmission and no reception. So it was somebody who actually got in trouble for it. Even worse than not listening is creating a climate of fear. If you're a boss and people are afraid to give you bad news, and if you criticize them, demote them, or humiliate them, you're not going to hear it. A great example of this is, although it is unfair to blame any one person for the financial meltdown that happened a few years ago, if you want to blame somebody, Michael Lewis tells you this is the guy. This is Joe Casano, who was at AIG. He led the unit that lost about $45 billion, which all of us U.S. taxpayers are now still bailing out, as I understand it. And so Michael Lewis did a bunch of reporting, and I love this part in particular. The way you dealt with Joe was to start everything by saying, "You're right, Joe." So certainly fear is bad, but one thing I always like to point out, and many of you who are managers or have managers as well too, may not be in a fear-laden situation, but even then, there's a lot of challenges to creating a situation where people feel safe telling you the truth, because there's a bunch of things going on in hierarchical life that are very difficult to avoid. And let me give you two of them, sort of the positive and the negative. The positive is there's actually a lot of evidence that when people say nice things to us and flatter us, even false flattery, even when we know they're just BSing us, we still like them more. So if you just think of hierarchical life, there's all sorts of incentive for people to tell you how good you look, how wonderful you are. And the story I always tell about this, I've got a colleague, Rod Kramer. Rod and I came to Stanford more or less the same time. I see Rod about once a year, and whenever I see him, he just about always says the same thing to me, which is, "Bob, you look good. You look like you lost weight." And first of all, I almost never have lost weight, by the way. Second of all, I always say to myself, he's just saying that, but then it makes me like Rod more. And so we as human beings, we got to be, and if you're in a position of authority, there's all these people have an incentive, and they may not realize it, and you may not even realize it. Then on the other side, and this is where the mum effect slide comes in, there's another pretty big body of research that shows that even when people give us bad news that's not their fault, we like them less. This is the sort of shoot the messenger problem. And so that's the other problem, is that there'll be some bad news floating around and nobody will tell the boss because they don't want the boss to have that negative emotional reaction. And in hierarchical life, this is one of the things that leads to filtering. And one of the best examples I know of this is the famous late Richard Feynman, certainly one of the most entertaining physicists and Nobel Prize winners who ever lived. And part of his amazing legacy is he was appointed to the Rogers Commission to help figure out why the Challenger space shuttle blew up. And he went rogue, and Rogers actually got quite mad at him because he ran around NASA asking questions in an unauthorized way. And one of the questions he asked, and amazing sort of, if you know the story, like he had this demonstration in front of Congress and he figured out the seals, just an incredible guy. But he also asked this hypothetical question about something that still has not happened. I guess we've got 2 more missions. Hopefully it won't happen. He asked people to estimate the probability that the main shuttle engine would fail. And sort of look at this. The engineers estimated 1 in 200 odds. The senior executives 1 in 100,000. And some of that might have been some PR BS, but some of that also is the sort of filtering. And if you know that case, stuff does not get up the hierarchy. And so even if you're the nicest, most benevolent boss in the world, you've got to be careful, because there's situations where people are going to be afraid to tell you the truth, because very often in this sort of unconscious way, it's in their best interest not to. So one of the things that organizations do to help sort of encourage an attitude of wisdom is to create situations where people can fight in an atmosphere of mutual respect. It's one of the hallmarks of organizations that overcome this problem, especially a good engineering organization. People fight over ideas. And I guess I should emphasize that I'm not saying that you should have fights with people because you hate one another. That's like really a bad sort of conflict. I'm talking about fighting in an atmosphere of mutual respect. So situations where people fight as if they are right and listen as if they are wrong. Having taught at Stanford for 26 or 27 years, I keep losing count. Our undergraduates in particular, how many of you were undergraduates? I'm going to get in trouble with this, are really good at fighting as if they're right, but the listening as if they're wrong part is sometimes a problem because you're all so smart. And so what the best bosses do is they make it safe to fight in an atmosphere of mutual respect. William Wrigley put this quite well. When two people in business always agree, one of them is unnecessary. So it's kind of cute. Probably the most interesting person who, at least I've interviewed in this domain or this account, is Brad Bird of Pixar. Brad is the Academy Award-winning director of Ratatouille and of The Incredibles. And it's sort of an interesting story. What happened with Brad Bird is he was brought into Pixar by Steve Jobs, Ed Catmull, and John Lasseter after they had had 3 hit movies. And unlike many organizations, they were worried that they were going to get in a success trap and start believing their own BS too much, which I think really speaks well for the senior management team. They brought in Brad, who'd been fired by all sorts of people for being overly obsessed. Well, what he's really obsessed with, getting to know him a little bit, is the notion of mediocrity is just anathema to him. I mean, he really is one of those people who always pushes for excellence. That's why he got fired at Disney, was for giving them grief about how mediocre they were. And also, apparently, why he got fired by The Simpsons as well. And The Simpsons has kind of gotten worse, by the way. So anyhow, so he was brought in, and his job was to shake things up. And when we interviewed him, he said, the first thing I did, this was to make The Incredibles, he said, I went to the people in HR and he said, I want your black sheep. I want the people who are ready to quit Pixar or who think that everything Pixar is doing is wrong. And this is like one of the most successful companies we have. And so he was brought in to sort of stir things up. And his motto, and this is from The Iron Giant, a film he did before, is everyone will get humiliated and encouraged together. So I think it's sort of a cute way to put it. So that's an argument for fighting. 2 other things about fighting. I'm arguing that creative groups fight and good leaders create fighting. You shouldn't fight when you're generating new ideas. At the very, very early stage, you kind of want to get the ideas on the table before you start ripping them apart. And then also, and this is another thing, I'm thinking of all the creative teams I've taught at the Stanford D School. There comes a point where when their idea gets killed off that they think is so great, they keep trying to push it back into the mix. There's a point where you've kind of got to shut up and help with the implementation of what's going on. So I'm not arguing for fighting all the time. The third thing, which is a quick thing, and there's a whole bunch of books coming out that are talking about small wins. There's a book called Little Bets that just came out, and there's a woman at Harvard called Teresa Mablé, is something on small wins. So small wins are all of a sudden very hot. But the small win stuff is interesting because what it shows is that although the most effective bosses and organizations will create these big, hairy goals that people can get behind and get excited about, is that if you just have the goals and don't show the stepping stones that people need to take, they freak out, they freeze up, and they literally can't act. So when you're a boss, it's your responsibility to help people figure out those stepping stones. And to give you a good example, there's one CEO I know who I've worked with a little bit, and she described to me how, and again, this is early 2009 when it wasn't much fun around here, and she presented to her team a goal that if they didn't have their most successful sales campaign in history, that they'd have to do a quite large-scale layoff. So she says, she sort of describes me, so I tell them that's our goal. It's like a 25% increase over the year before. And she said they all started yelling at me. They started freaking out. And she said she realized she kind of made a mistake because what she did was she sort of calmed down and she passed out the yellow sticky notes. I don't know whether they were yellow actually, but they were sticky notes. And she asked them to write on the sticky notes all the steps they would need to take, this is her senior team, for it to be a successful sales campaign. And pretty soon, they had more than 100 sticky notes, and she did this really cool thing. So the sticky notes are the little steps they need to take, but then she drew a line on the board and wrote easy and hard. And they put the easy ones up and the hard one, and she said they worked just the next week just on accomplishing the easy ones to get some traction and some encouragement. And to me, that's a pretty good example of the initial problem of people freaking out and then breaking it into small wins with the added twist of the low-hanging fruit. So I thought that was actually pretty cool. Okay, 2 more points, and then I've got a couple wrap-up points. So we'll probably, and maybe 20, 22 after, it's just a rough guess. And then we can, because I want to have some comments. One other point which I got quite interested in writing this book, well, one's an old theme and the other one's a newer one, is this notion of stars and rotten apples. So let me start out with the stars. So one of the things, and this goes back to a lot of work that Jeff Pfeffer and I have done, is that in the process of thinking about organizations that are good at fostering cooperative work, one of the things we see over and over again is the question that we tend to ask is, who are you making your superstars? Are they people who get ahead by stomping on others on the way to the top? Or are they people who help the others around them succeed? And it's pretty simple, but there's all sorts of organizations that have much different reward systems and performance evaluation systems, to use that word. And the ones that tend to reward the team players tend to be better at collaborative work in particular. And the reason I've got the Men's Warehouse example is that long ago, this is like 1997 or something, when Jeff Pfeffer and I were writing one of our book, my first management book, The Knowing Doing Gap. Jeff attended Suits University, so it was sort of ran by the Men's Warehouse, the off-sale sort of, or the wholesale men's clothing place. And when he went to Men's Warehouse, George Zimmer, the guy you see on TV who says, "I guarantee it," told a story about their Seattle store. And what happened at their Seattle store was they had a problem where they had a guy who kept undermining what they call the team selling environment. So the way it works when you walk into a Men's Warehouse is there's one person is getting the commission, but the other folks in the store are supposed to help it be sort of like a team experience. And that's how it's supposed to feel. But this guy was their top salesperson in the Northwestern area, and he kept stealing sales from other folks, bad-mouthing the team selling concept. And so what they did was they fired him, which is, the classic sort of superstar salesman problem, salesperson problem. But the interesting thing was, after they got rid of him, although no individual salesperson reached his level of stardom, sales went up about 30% in the store. So it's sort of like a good indication of how toxic a person can be. So this brings us to the notion of how toxic, sort of bad, selfish, negative people can be. And to sort of oversimplify it, if you sort of ask what's more important for a boss, to eliminate the negative or accentuate the positive, there's a pretty big body of research, and if you want to send me an email, I'll send you the seminal paper, which is called Bad is Stronger Than Good, which shows that what ends up happening is that whether we're talking about work relationships or we're talking about personal relationships, that bad interactions with people pack much larger wallops than big ones. So in the workplace, there's a situation where if you have a bad encounter with somebody at work, an unpleasant one, it packs 5 times the effect on mood than a good one. And then when we move to personal relationships, and this is more important than the work stuff for those of us who are trying to maintain personal relationships, it turns out marriages, dating relationships, and so on, when you go below 5 to 1, so for every bad interaction you don't have at least 5 good ones, the relationships tend to fall apart. So I've been married a long time, like forever, it seems like, 26 or 27 years. I'm kind of forgetting, actually, at this point. And I sort of tell myself that when I've been bad, that I have to do 5 good things to make up for what I've done. So that's the rule I follow. And this sort of brings us to the notion of teams and the toxicness of sort of negative, destructive people. And there's this great article, and there's even a This American Life episode on this article, which is unusual for an academic article. Some of you may have heard, by Will Phelps and others. And essentially what they show across a bunch of studies is that if you've just got one rotten apple in your group, one person who is, well, I would call them an asshole, somebody who is like a deadbeat, doesn't work hard enough, somebody who's really depressive, that the overall performance of the team goes down 30 or 40%. And Phelps argues that there's two main reasons this happens. The first is that when you've got a rotten apple on your team, what happens is you end up devoting too much attention to dealing with the rotten apple and not enough attention to the performance issues. And then the other reason the performance goes down is that there's a fair amount of evidence that negative emotions are especially contagious. So you literally catch the disease from them. So that's an argument you should get rid of them. And to give you one example of sort of my favorite story about a rotten apple, after I'd published the no asshole rule, so I was reading Fortune magazine. You know, some of you may see in Fortune magazine, every year they come up with the best place to work survey. So I'm reading the best place to work survey. And there, I think it was at number 39 then, there's this company called Baird, a financial services firm, and there's a one-sentence description, which was, they tout their no asshole rule. So I got all excited. These guys are actually talking about it. They're publishing it in Fortune magazine. So pretty quickly, I got on the phone with this guy, Paul Purcell, and I talked to his head of HR, too. And we talked a bunch about how he enforces it. And one of the things he said, which was incredibly entertaining, and this is the quote, he says, during the interview, I tell them that if I discover they're an asshole, I'm going to fire them. He said, I look them in the eye. I've never heard of the selection technique. Maybe we don't use it at Stanford. But he said that every now and then, he said, somebody will turn pale and you'll never see him again, stuff like that. But the thing that I thought was most interesting is when I asked him, I said, well, what do you mean by somebody being an asshole? Because in my book, I tend to describe such people as people who leave others feeling demeaned and de-energized. But he, in some ways, I think, had a better answer for organizations. And it kind of goes back to the George Zimmer definition that he said people like that are people who consistently put their own needs ahead of their colleagues, customers, and the organization. And I thought that was actually pretty good. And by the way, if all financial services firms would apply this, I think we'd all be better off. But I thought that was a pretty interesting definition. Okay, one more, and then we'll move to a couple of wrap-up points. One of the other chapters, and something that I really got quite obsessed when writing the book, was when you look at the hallmark of what people will describe as a good boss, the kind of boss they want to work for in particular, it's somebody who has my back. And to dig in just a little bit more, basically people who shield you to the extent that's reasonable from harm, indignities, stupid little intrusions. One of the hallmarks of good bosses. This could just be visitors, so I love this definition from Henry Mintzberg. As a manager is somebody who sees visitors so that other people can get their work done. I can tell you my office is down the hall from Jim Plummer's. He sees like 100 times more visitors than I do. Thank goodness. I'm glad he's talking to them and I'm not, frankly. So that's part of like a dean's or other manager's job. Meetings. Now, meetings are one of those things that, in fact, my colleague Jeff Pfeffer and I sometimes argue about this. And so I've written 2 books with Jeff, and we fight constantly. And Jeff's latest book is called Power, and it's about all these ways you can grab power and show like you're the person in charge. And Jeff will actually advise that if you really want to get power, you'll do stuff like you'll arrive to meetings a little late to show that it's so important the meeting can't start without you. And then the other thing you would do is keep people longer, because even if there isn't any more work to do, that shows you're more important than anything else in their life, be it work life or non-work life. And I sort of say to Jeff, that's great if you want to get power, but if you actually cared about the people you worked for, you might actually want to end meetings early so they could get off and do their work, and then maybe have as few meetings as possible. And so the reason I have Will Wright here, famous sort of game designer, is he describes this employee-centered method he uses during meetings, which is, he used to have one guy, Ocean Quigley, the actual person's name, who when Ocean Quigley started looking bored and raised his hand and asked to be excused, that was a sign the meeting should be over. So he had sort of like the canary in the coal mine guy. And the other thing that Will Wright did was he charged people $1 whenever they would call a meeting just to get them to think about it a little bit. By the way, having been at Stanford for a long time, the guy who was most amazing on meetings was John Hennessy when he was dean of the School of Engineering. John hates long meetings. And it was great because we'd have meetings with him, and they'd be scheduled for an hour. They'd last like 9 minutes. And anybody who's ever dealt with John, he is so decisive. He kind of says 3 things. Yes, no, I'll get back to you later. And I'm talking about major decisions. So with John, you never had the feeling he was keeping you too long. And, John has a lot to do, so that's kind of cool. The other thing that good bosses do is they find ways to protect people from idiocy from on high. The fact is that in many organizations of all sizes, there's some idiocy that flows down. And my favorite idiocy story happened when I was a new assistant professor at Stanford. It seems like 1,000 years ago, but I did a dissertation on organizational death, the process by which organizations are sort of unwound after the decision was made. So long ago, I was like reading the San Francisco Chronicle, which I guess I still do, although I'm not sure why. And so I was reading the San Francisco Chronicle, and what? I'm sorry, you used to work at the Chronicle. I'm sorry, there isn't much left in it anymore. I feel badly, but anyways. So I was reading the San Francisco Chronicle, and there was an announcement that a large bank was going to close 125 branches. And so I wrote them a letter, and pretty soon I was talking to these all guys called the Rat Patrol. That was the retail action team, and they called themselves the Rat Patrol. They were overseeing the closing of 125 branches. And so the interesting thing was, to get to know me, they sent me out and they said, well, we'll send you to 4 good closings and 4 bad closings, and to try to figure out the difference between what's happening in the closings. And the difference was actually pretty clear, which was that in the good closings, in every case, the branch manager would talk about how they were ignoring the procedures from the Rat Patrol. And I still remember I was in San Jose, there was a branch manager, and he holds up like this big book from the Rat Patrol, and he said, "The secret to my success is I ignored everything in this book." So, and then you see where this is going. The bad closings in all those cases sort of like was the opposite story, which was, we tried to follow the procedures. It was so frustrating were the words we heard over and over again, but we just couldn't do it. And by the way, as a little sort of footnote here, and you can all imagine this happening. I was a young assistant professor. I was probably 32 or so then. And I guess I was naive enough to come in and tell them the truth and sort of give them a headline, sort of like I just gave you. So there's 5 people in the room, and within like 2 minutes, they all left except for like the most junior guy who escorted me to the elevator, and I never saw them again. But anyhow, also, I gave a talk at the Commonwealth Club. I should add this. I gave a talk at the Commonwealth Club, and a guy came up to me afterwards, and he walked up to me and he said, so this is just this year, it's like 20-something years later, and he said, "I was on the Rat Patrol." And I said, "Oh no, he's going to go after me." And he said, "That was the most screwed up team I was ever on in my life." So I got a little new confirmation. Anyway, one other example, and I can't resist this. This is not in the book. I just got permission from Ed Catmull to use it. So I've been lucky that in addition to doing some interviews, I've done some variation of this talk 2 or 3 times at Pixar this year. I can't even remember. And I love Pixar. It's like my favorite organization on all dimensions. And, well, except for maybe I do. I might even love them more. But so the spiritual head and the CEO and the person who's the driving cultural force behind Pixar is Ed Catmull. That's him. And he's sitting next to a guy there named Alvy Ray Smith. And Pixar has such a long, twisted history, I can't even begin to touch the details here. But there was one point in Pixar's history where they were part of the George Lucas empire. And there was a point where, and some of you may know that Steve Jobs bought it for something like $5 million, in part because George Lucas was going through an expensive divorce and needed the money. And Jobs kept saying, "I'll give you $5 million. He kept saying, "No, no, no," and finally he got it. But this was during the period that they were prettying up what actually became Pixar. It wasn't even called Pixar then, for sales. And also they were trying to cut costs in the Lucas empire. And there was an efficiency expert type guy who George Lucas hired who kept pressing Ed Catmull, and that's Alvy Ray Smith next to him, the guy who invented what basically made modern digital movies possible. Modern digital animated movies possible. And they kept getting all this pressure to give this guy a layoff list. So every morning they come in and say, "Where's the layoff list? Where's the layoff list?" And finally it was, "We have to have the layoff list by tomorrow morning, or it's kind of like all over. We're going to shut the whole thing down." So what happened was that Alvy Ray Smith and Ed Catmull gave him a list with 2 names on it, Ed Catmull and Alvy Ray Smith. And that case, it's one of those interesting little stories that every time I go to Pixar and give a talk, one of the old-timers comes up to me and tells me that story, because it's one of the reasons that Ed is so well loved is that they feel like Ed's got their backs. And one thing I would really emphasize, I got approval to use this from Ed Catmull, and he said, I don't want to leave the impression that layoffs are always a bad idea. Sometimes they are necessary. But he said that was a bad business decision, so that's why we fought so hard. So I want to really emphasize that Ed Catmull sort of insisted I add that. Okay, 2 parting thoughts, and then hopefully we can have some time for some conversation. Quickly, because this one is a pretty quick one, although it's not fair to pick one magical question to figure out whether you're a good boss or, in fact, a good team member. If I was going to pick one, there's some cool research that's being done by a guy named Rob Cross at University of Virginia. He's done this in more than 50 companies, and he keeps finding the best predictor of whether or not somebody is in a network of innovative people, whether or not individuals are promoted, whether or not they stay in an organization, is the simple question he asks, which is, of the people in their social network, after you talk to this person, do you have more or less energy? And I think it's a pretty cool question, and you might want to think of the bosses you've worked with and the effects that you have on others. And one other thing I would emphasize is this is not an argument for charisma or being exciting. What Rob Cross talks about is the people who tend to be energizers are actually people who others sort of trust and make them feel more confident, not necessarily sort of like a razzle-dazzle sort of person. All right, and then the second one, which I'm doing at the alumni folks' request, is sort of to go back to the no asshole rule and to just offer you some thoughts where I hope not very many of you have lousy bosses, and I won't ask, is some ideas about dealing with lousy bosses. Let's sort of like switch gears and go back to the no asshole rule. And so in putting together sort of a short guide, this is kind of what I came up with. The first thing is, if you can get out, get out. If you possibly can, all of the research is really, if it's bad, and some of us are in situations for personal reasons, for financial reasons, where you just can't get out for now, so I understand that. But the evidence really is, if you've got a lousy boss, that they're going to do damage. So that's my first sort of diagnostic questions. The other one is to think about what kind of lousy boss you've got. If they're merely incompetent, maybe you can wait a little bit longer, because I mean, some of it might rub off on you, but the evidence in competent bosses, you know, especially the nice ones, are kind of weird, actually. You have like a nice and competent boss, and you kind of feel bad. So you can wait a while longer. They're unlikely to do much damage to you. If you've got somebody who is an asshole, the evidence actually is pretty clear that the amount of damage they can do to your physical and mental health is bad enough that I would say turn up the volume and running for the exits. And then finally, if you've got the double whammy, well, to me, that's a sign you better really run for the exit. So those are sort of my diagnostic questions. To me, there's 3 basic strategies. One is there might be some situations, and this is where you've really got to do the calculation, to give the boss the direct negative feedback. So, and by the way, and this is something I talk about in Good Boss, Bad Boss, there's a lot of evidence that we human beings are quite unaware of our weaknesses. We're incredibly blind to it. In fact, if you look at the research, the 2 groups of people are going to be, or bosses, especially unaware, are either really overbearing bosses. Well, they're kind of a problem. And also, it's great and scary research called unskilled and unaware of it. It turns out that the more incompetent that people are at a task, the more they overestimate their skills. So you've got to consider the possibility that your boss might actually just be unaware of his or her weaknesses, and maybe you could pull them aside and have like a polite but frank conversation. You've got to do that calculation. The other thing is fighting and biting back in public. In general, I don't recommend this, and I've done it in my life, and I've been sorry to tell you the truth several times. But it might reach a point where you feel like that's the only thing you can do to defend your honor. And in fact, where I got this from initially, so even before the no asshole rule was published, I was actually interviewed by Ronald Reagan's son. And I didn't know he's a radio host, or at least used to be in Seattle. And so he described when he was a dancer that when he would get like abused a little bit too much in public, he'd have to fight back to the creative director because to show him that he was tough enough not to be pushed around. The other thing I would add, and this is something you'll see from me again, is that to the extent you can do this in a posse, you can do this with others, you're probably safer than doing it yourself. And you've also got to do sort of like the little risk analysis here, which is how much risk am I willing to take if they blow up on me, and what's the likelihood of the person's personality. So that's one. The next one is to sort of sneak around them. And again, you've got to sort of do the political calculation. So using the system. So the first thing here, every HR person, every attorney will tell you, the more closely you can document it, the better shape you're in for all sorts of reasons. And again, I would ask, you got to do the political calculation, which is how much power does your boss have? How do you think he or she is going to respond to criticism? Because the boss is all powerful. If it's Steve Jobs at Apple, your odds probably aren't too good of winning. I would just pick one example. I think it's safe. And once again, and we've now got a couple of peer-reviewed research articles that back this up, that to the extent you can do it with others, you will be in a more powerful position. And one of my favorite stories, this was actually a government employee, an animal control officer. And she wrote me this sort of detailed sort of set of emails where she explained, and sort of as the saga unfolded, that they had an asshole boss. But what they did first initially was she went and complained to the boss's boss about this difficult person. And it was like, this is a civil service job you'll never get rid of. It was actually her. But what she did was she got together with her coworkers and they put together what she called the asshole diaries. And what they did was they had all this documentation. They brought it to the boss's boss, and actually they did get rid of this person. And this is consistent with some peer-reviewed research. And we're at 7:30, so I'm going to go through this one sort of quickly. The other strategy, which is probably not great in the long term, but in the short term, sometimes we all get in situations where we've got to endure that lousy boss. And there's a bunch of things that seem to work here to join or form a support group. I won't name the school, but there's one school I know that, it's not Stanford, where they had a dean who the staff hated. This is a true story. And what they did was they formed a prayer group. These were the assistants, where they would pray that something would happen to the dean that was bad enough he had to quit, but not so bad it was really like life-threatening or anything like that. So I thought it was so interesting. The other thing is to find some way to limit contact with the person as much as possible, to sort of view the person as a toxin. So that's one strategy that I've heard. That's one of the great things about email, and maybe even phone calls actually can be pretty obnoxious, but that's one of the great things about communication technologies. Look for small victories. There's a bunch of evidence where people have feelings of control, that they have little victories. Probably the stupidest one that in the process of writing the no asshole rule I heard about was a woman, and this is one of those weird food things. She had a boss who kept stealing food off her desk. And this is like the classic sort of power thing. So what she did was she made candies out of X-Lax. And after he ate them, she told him what happened. And anyhow, so she said it was this sort of great victory that she got. But she said he was still a jerk after that. Reframe the situation just in the name of time. I'm not going to tell you the whole story. We can talk about it later. But in these two, the basic message, and this is one of the things that I actually tell new assistant professors sometimes at Stanford, is that there's all this stuff going around and there's all this stuff to get upset about. But what really matters is writing N numbers of peer-reviewed articles so we can keep it around. And that's pretty, there's other things in our system, but that's number one. And it's this ability to practice the fine art of emotional detachment. Because sometimes there are things in life where you can't control it, you can't stop it, and you've kind of got to get through it. And becoming a little bit more emotionally detached, not letting it touch your soul, is sometimes the best we can do. And it's something I, frankly, am not very good at doing, because I'm one of those sort of like overly emotional person who probably cares too much about things and responds too strongly. But even like in my 50s, I've sort of learned to do a little bit of emotional detachment rather than just, and I think that it does help with our physical and mental health, at least in the short term. Okay, so I'm a little bit over. Do we have time for a few questions? Are we okay? Okay. So why don't we declare the official whatever prepared remarks over, and I hope you have some comments or questions. And they've asked that you use the microphones. Is that correct? Yes?
Yes, for the recording.
For the recording. Okay, so hopefully somebody has some comments or questions, and I'd love to hear some. And escape if you have to. It's late. See who's going for the microphone and who's going. Oh, great.
I'm not leaving.
Great.
So actually, one question I had then, based on it, So when you look at, obviously, a good boss or bad boss, how do you evaluate that ahead of time? Correct? You say, the bad thing, if you're a bad boss, you have to exit. But, you obviously, you want to try to avoid entering into something like that. And, in a job interview or anything like that, what is as a diagnostic or tools, what do you use to say, is this person going to be a good boss or are they going to be a bad boss? So
my perspective, there's all sorts of ways to do intelligence on firms. There's things like Glassdoor. Like if you look at HP at Glassdoor versus, for example, Facebook or Apple, there's huge differences. So you can get some hints at the company level. But that's not a very good predictor of the boss. And the thing I always say is in the interview, it's hard to tell sometimes. You might want to look if they won't let you get in a word edgewise. If everybody around the boss seems sort of terrified of the person, you can look for those little diagnostic signs. But the best thing you can do, and I always say this, and it's not always possible, but sometimes it is to find somebody who used to work for the person, because that's where you tend to get the truth. And this is where I would say that having gossip networks are actually pretty effective. And my wife had some great experiences where she almost worked for flaming assholes until she found out the truth. So that's number one on the list if you can get it. But looking for the little signs in interviews might help. I'm going to go to this side. I'm going to be democratic or fair. Yes?
I recently left a job where I had all sorts of bad boss situations. But one of the advice that my attorney gave me was don't talk to HR at all.
Wow.
So, and that's a little bit different than what you.
No, so you're not the first person to tell me this.
Because HR works for the man.
Okay, so I would listen to this advice, and there are some organizations where it isn't true, but there's enough of them where it isn't that I appreciate you bringing up that perspective. So thank you, fellow over here.
Actually, two parts. First part is what is Ruth Satan cesspool strategy, and the second part is what about servant leadership? Servant leadership.
So let's ask it. People are always talking about servant leadership. Why don't you define what it is? Because, go ahead.
Well, to me, a servant leader is someone who does put all his people underneath him, above in the fact that he's there to empower them to do their best job.
So I think that's consistent with my message. But I would still argue that even though he or she is putting them above, that boss still ultimately actually does have authority over them. So there are still some of those differences, but to the extent somebody can see themselves as a servant leadership, and by the way, I hate to say nice things about my dean, but I really think Jim Plummer does have that perspective. That it hasn't been true of every dean I've had at Stanford, but he really does have that mindset. So I would say I actually have a servant leader boss, and I can sort of tell it, but he's still the boss. So this Ruth Satan cesspool strategy, which I actually wrote about in the New York Times, you can probably find it on my blog. So this is somebody I knew who worked for just a horrible boss, just really sort of abusive, and she was in the situation of sort of like reframing it and getting through it. And the way she got through it was when she went to meetings, she remembered at one point she was in this horrible meeting with this guy that when she was a teenager, she'd gone river rafting in the American River. And the guide taught her that when she fell out of the boat, what she should do is rather than fight the current, she should relax and put her legs out in front of her and gently bump off the boulders. And in fact, she fell out of the boat. This is in something that was called the Satan cesspool. That's where it comes from. And she put her feet out in front of her, and she said it was sort of cool. She just bounced off the rocks and didn't fight it. And then when she got in the meetings with the asshole boss, when he would start attacking her, she said she sort of half shut her eyes and put her feet out in front of hers and have the words bounce off her feet. So it's sort of like this coping and reframing strategy of it not touching your soul. So that's where it came from. Yeah.
First, two questions. First one's easy. What did the guy at Pixar do when he invited the troublemakers in? And second, or the guys that HR was low on?
Uh-huh.
Just curious about that. What did he do with them? And secondly, more interestingly, perhaps, how much of this do you think applies to Steve Jobs or Larry Ellison or Chambers or Zuckerberg or those guys?
The second one, let me start with the second one. I don't really know them well enough. I will make a comment about Zuckerberg, even though this is being recorded, which is I don't know Zuckerberg at all. I met him once. And, you know, I don't know the extent to which the movie is fiction or not. I do have to give them credit for bringing the entire company to the movie the day it came out. Do you know this? They rented all this. But I do know some members of Zuckerberg's team, independently of his qualities, since I don't really know Zuckerberg. It's amazing the degree to which the people on his team have the ability to create like what I would describe as a full sort of civilized human being, basically. So I know the head of HR. There's a guy, Stanford grad, symbolic systems, named Chris Cox, who is sort of the Energizer bunny of the place. So that's the other advice I give, and I'm being very careful because I don't really know the facts about Zuckerberg. I don't know him well enough, is that if you're going to be an asshole boss, surround yourself with wonderful people that can offset the negative effects. What was your other question?
I was just curious what happened at Pixar when the newcomer came in.
So what Brad Bird did was he started pushing them, especially the people in IT, to make things look more realistic and to use more computing power than they ever thought was possible for a meeting. In fact, where I heard about Brad Bird was just a faculty member, Margaret Brando, in our department. Her brother, Greg Brando, was the CIO when Brad came in, and they butted heads a lot. But between them, it was actually quite constructive headbutting. And if you watch The Incredibles compared to the 3 movies before it, the water in the hair is incredibly good at a level that nobody at Pixar thought was possible until the black sheep started pushing. So it was constructive conflict. It wasn't I hate you. It was we're going to do this. No, we can't do it. Yeah, we can do it. It was that sort of tension. Fellow over here.
So for those of us who work at global companies or with offices in other countries, can you comment on the applicability of your research across cultures, other than the U.S.? Well,
so I mean, I think that at the most abstract level, actually, I think of Singapore in particular. We've done a lot of work with Singapore, a group of us at the D School in the last year, that there are some cultural differences. Certainly, the notion of, for example, constructive conflict is something that does not work very well in sometimes in Asian cultures. Although one thing we figured out, and this is also Ido's experience, is that when you remove all the bosses from the room and have all peers, actually, at least some Korean and Singaporean companies we work with are actually pretty good. So it's the authority that creates the problem. But at an abstract level, at least in every culture I've ever worked with in my life, the boss that people want is somebody who is both benevolent and competent. And I think that works across human societies, but the way that it plays out varies from culture to culture. And in particular, I think the openness of conflict and disagreement, I think, is something you really have to be culturally sensitive to. But that applies to companies, too. There's some companies where you yell at people pretty directly, and like Intel, constructive conflict. And there's others like old HP where they were so polite you couldn't even tell they were fighting unless you were an insider. So you get that in U.S. companies. But yeah, that's not a fair answer, but certainly the global stuff does make a difference. Okay, so when do we end? Because I don't want to. So maybe why don't we do you 3 and declare victory? Is that fair? Okay. Okay. So and we'll do them quick.
Okay. So you talked a lot about assholes. What about kind of managing people that are in the middle and you just feel will always be kind of in the middle and you don't see, they're nice, they get some stuff done, but you just don't see that
So it's people who are just moderately competent but are not great?
Yeah, and they're not making anyone worse, but they're not having potential to do great things.
Well, my perspective, if it's the classic B players thing, the research on B players is actually pretty interesting, which is that although people sometimes will complain and say, I want only A players, that very often they're the people who make the organization work on a day-to-day basis, so they actually can be very important. And so I would not dismiss them so quickly. And even like the research on A players often shows that they leave so quickly and they have such short-term time perspectives that the A players often aren't as hot as you think that they are. So I'm always a little bit skeptical about saying, oh, well, they're just B players. On the other hand, one thing, especially around here, some of the best organizations I know, the definition of the people who are okay in the middle will be people who have the same intolerance for mediocrity as the A players, but they just can't give as much. So I'm not making an argument for mediocrity, but the people who are just sort of middle performers are actually very important. But the people who are lousy are different. Okay, quick. We've got to go quick.
All right, so I don't know if I'm a good boss or a bad boss, but I'm pretty certain I've been a bad boss.
Oh, we got a confessional. Yeah, I love this.
Well, not quite. But what do you have to say on recovery strategies for bad bosses?
On what?
On recovery strategies.
The recovery strategy. So one thing, this is actually a great question. There's actually a lot of evidence that despite the born versus made, it actually is something that you need to learn to do. It's like management is not something that people are necessarily born with. In fact, if you look at what great companies do, and I hate to go back to the old HP, but they did this for years, they would not throw people in a position where they had an enormous amount of responsibility. In fact, I worked with two former senior HP executives, and they both will tell you we each started out with one subordinate. So we could only mess up one person. And then what they would do is actually coach people along the way. And I do think in sort of the startup land we live in, often there isn't really time to like deal with those details. And a lot of the people around here, I think, learn by fire. And a lot of people I know who will tell you they weren't very good bosses, were in their 20s, that they sort of learn eventually through the process. So my short answer is it's a learn by doing situation. And sometimes it happens one at a time, and the best companies put some structure around it. And even like I know that this is something that both Apple and Google are trying to figure out, of how to sort of develop people, not just to sort of like throw them in there and hope that they can do the job. So the last thing I would say is that either you're good or you're bad or you're out. There's actually developmental stuff. Okay, you got the last question.
Okay, I have a question about the peer review process, or the review process in general. It seems like in most of my work experiences, you're involved in a unilateral review process where your boss really is the one, or your manager is the one reviewing you. I had the fortitude of working for an organization that adopted the 360 review process, which seemed to be very effective. And then I had worked in an organization where they had decided to form a moral committee because the organization was extraordinarily toxic. The environment was really toxic. And when we proposed the idea of a 360 review process, they took it off the table immediately. So I guess the question is, what has the trend been in terms of formulating a peer review process and a 360 review process, and how effective has it been in changing organizations?
So the research on peer review and 360s, and I actually would separate them a little bit, because there are a few organizations I know that will put more weight on peer review than anything else. In fact, in the good old days at IDEO, they used to have a peer review process where you'd pick 2 people to do your review, and that was it. And they always say that's when the toughest reviews happened. So peers can actually be quite tough. But the research on peer reviews, there's a woman or 360 reviews. There's a woman, Jenny Chapman at Berkeley, did some research. Is they're fine to do, and they work quite effectively. But the one disease you've got to watch out for, and this is a problem that HR can sometimes create, is that they can become so burdensome and so time-consuming that you end up spending, like in one organization I worked with, they claimed they were spending a month a year on their peer review process. So that's my main sort of concern about 360s, is I think that it's conceptually right, but the challenge is to make it in such a way that it doesn't take too much time or energy. Because in some organizations, there's one I'm thinking of in particular, it became like standardized testing for my kids, where they seem to spend all their time preparing for and taking the test and not actually learning anything. And so you got to be careful of that analogy. But when they're done lightly, they're actually quite effective. So I guess maybe we should sort of like end on that. Okay, so it's quite late as it is. So thank you very much for showing up and sticking around. I appreciate it. Thank you. All right. Great.